Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to be talking about the year 2001 in Dungeons & Dragons history, the 28th year of Dungeons & Dragons history. We talked about through the filter of clear, catalyst, location, entity, artifact, relationship. So who was the catalyst for Dungeons & Dragons in 2001? Well, that was a very nice lady by the name of J.K. Rowling. All right, and she had written Harry Potter, the first of the Harry Potter novels. And in 2001, the Harry Potter series is rolling, right? No pun intended. It's rolling along. And so it's incredibly important to understand the role of J.K. Rowling in the history of Dungeons & Dragons, right? So one of the things that's really important to understand in 2001 is that to understand Rowling, we have to understand Tolkien. So Tolkien was fantasy start. It was really the start of fantasy as something that could be accepted in the mainstream, and where incredibly compelling stories could be told, funny stories could be told, adventurous stories could be told using fantasy, and not just people who were deep in the weeds, but pretty much anybody who really liked adventure or humor or magic could really enjoy these stories. And Tolkien really brought fantasy to the masses and delivered an incredible series of books that would solidify fantasy as a mainstream element for decades to come. Okay. Now, J.K. Rowling is fantasy now, right? So Tolkien got the whole ball started, right, and he got the ball rolling, and there, with fantasy, and fantasy being a relevant story archetype within the modern world. But Rowling is really fantasy now, and it's important to understand that because fantasy, after it got its start from Tolkien, really stumbled at a few certain points, and after a few decades, people were like, this is old, this is tired, you can't make fantasy movies. Boy, is that true, man. You can count on one hand the number of decent fantasy movies that have ever been made, right? So bringing fantasy to the big screen and the small screen proved to be incredibly difficult. Virtually no one did it, right? And the reality is lots of us would read these amazing fantasy novels, and then we would wait for television or movies to bring these to the muggles. Again, no pun intended. The normies, right? The people who weren't, just genre marinated, and it never delivered, right? Like just television and movies just never delivered the magic we saw in the novels, right? So one of the things that happens with J.K. Rowling is the movies do deliver a much better and much more contemporary version of her stories. And they're very close to the original books. And also J.K. Rowling starts something which was the midnight book parties. People would be so excited about the releases of Harry Potter books that they would gather at grocery stores, at bookshops, all across the country in the United States of America. And, to this day, there are millions of people who remember buying books at midnight at bookstores and grocery stores and all kinds of different places, mostly bookstores and grocery stores. I'll explain grocery stores at some other point, but grocery stores was a thing. Look it up. So that's the issue is, J.K. Rowling attaches just an immense amount of goodwill onto fantasy, and that is incredibly important for the momentum and the success we see attached to Dungeons & Dragons today. Some people are saying that right now in 2019 we're in a golden age for Dungeons & Dragons, and I think that there is absolutely a really good argument that is 100% true, right? And that comes from a goodwill that was delivered from J.K. Rowling. So her importance to Dungeons & Dragons cannot be understated. So what was the location for Dungeons & Dragons in 2001, right? Well, this is a very sad one, but it was the Twin Towers in Manhattan, New York City, right? And the reason why this is the key location for 2001 for Dungeons & Dragons is, the falling of the Twin Towers in New York City at 9/11, the 9/11 event, where two planes slammed into the Twin Towers in New York City, and thousands of people died, and America had the greatest attack on its soil that has ever occurred. It changed Dungeons and Dragons people's lives, and it changed everyone's lives. There was just absolutely no one left untouched by this. Today in America, IDs, right? Our identification cards, our driver's licenses, our passports, all of it. In the old days, these were things that you paid attention to, and you absolutely needed them, and you needed to make sure that they were up to date. Now they're absolutely essential, right? If you have problems with your ID, there's virtually nothing you can do in this life that is of significance, right? It is incredibly difficult to work. It's incredibly difficult to purchase. Identification has become probably the most important factor of every American person's life since 9/11, and it changed everything. It was a super sad, terrible event. It absolutely penetrated the year 2001 with sadness for all Dungeons and Dragons players, for Dungeons and Dragons designers, for Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Masters, and for Dungeons and Dragons players. Not a single table, not a single game, not a single campaign was not unaffected by this, right? Like, it literally interrupted a lot of games. There were people who were so sad they couldn't continue their campaigns. There were people so sad they couldn't continue to play. And there were designers who their work was interrupted and their work was impacted. I don't think there's really a single Dungeons and Dragons player, certainly not in America, who was not impacted by the falling of the Twin Towers. So our location, the Twin Towers in Manhattan, New York City, 2000 will be the last year they exist, and it was a major location within the year 2000. Who was our entity in 2001? Well, our entity in 2001 is Denzel Washington, and he does a movie called Training Day. This is a really fascinating film. He does it with a young gentleman by the name of Ethan Hawke. But this film is really important in the history of 2001, and it's important in American history, and it absolutely impacted how Dungeons and Dragons players looked at justice, right? So Training Day is a classic. It's a really important film. In America, there's so much. I would like to say a third to half of our entertainment contains stories about law enforcement. And Training Day was one of the most realistic and most eye-opening movies about law enforcement that come in a long time. And Denzel Washington's performance is so strong that it makes a lot of dungeon masters who have seen the film look at the concepts of justice and ethics, right? Justice, morality, and ethics. And this movie deeply explores this, right? And so Dungeons and Dragons, which is a story about people killing monsters and often combating humans, right? And then also the concept within Dungeons and Dragons of humans being monsters, that's all right there in Training Day, right? So Training Day points toward the realities of the Dungeons and Dragons game being incredibly versatile in telling stories and answering questions and opening questions about justice, morality, and ethics. And Training Day is this huge exclamation point to every single dungeon master out there saying, this can be done with nuance, this can be done with quality, this can be done with momentum, right? And Training Day is a hugely important movie for Dungeons and Dragons players, and specifically Dungeons and Dragons designers, right? About, who gets killed, who does the killing, like it's why do we fight, right? All that is deeply embedded in the film Training Day, and Denzel Washington delivers an amazing performance, and so it's important in the history of Dungeons and Dragons. What is our artifact in 2001? Our artifact is the Razor Scooter. The Razor Scooter was a really cool device in 2001, where essentially you could fold that thing up and just put it in a backpack, or you could carry it, right? In even more portable than a skateboard, right? The Razor scooters were incredibly affordable, incredibly portable, and incredibly effective form of transportation. And it aided in bringing back a mode of transportation that was affordable, portable, and effective for younger players and younger dungeon masters who were able to continue to go even a few blocks more easily, right? And to spread those games out and to continue to allow transportation to be part of the spread of Dungeons & Dragons, because it was easier for gamers, for dungeon masters and players to meet together, because they had this gas-free, very affordable way to actually physically get their games together. And so the Razor Scooter was important for Dungeons & Dragons, dungeon masters and players, particularly younger ones, right? Last is, what is the relationship in 2001 for Dungeons & Dragons? So the relationship is to activism, right? Now today, there is it's best to take a good look in 2019 at Dungeons & Dragons Twitter. Dungeons & Dragons Twitter is absolutely a thing. There are hundreds, if not well over 1,000 Dungeons & Dragons designers. Of course, third party, would be in there as well. DM skills, writers. There's just like map makers, mini makers. Like, if you are connected to Dungeons & Dragons production, both primary or secondary or tertiary, you are on Twitter, right? And there's a huge amount of conversation going on there. So you'll see all those D&D fans yucking it up and talking and, yakking it up and talking to each other about Dungeons & Dragons. And then two tweets down, you will see a lot of political talk, right? So it's really important to understand that that activism, people in Occupy Wall Street, people who are very involved in activism for LGBTQ rights, people are very involved for activism for gender equality, people are very involved in activism for justice, for many social justice causes as well. Right now, and this really starts to spin up in 2001, right? You see activism starting to be the Venn diagram between Dungeons & Dragons designers, between Dungeons & Dragons dungeon masters, between Dungeons & Dragons players, and activism. There is a ton of overlap, right? And so activism will have a strong relationship to Dungeons & Dragons in 2001, and it will continue to have a strong relationship with Dungeons & Dragons all the way up through the year 2019, right? So that is a clear history of the 28th year of history for Dungeons & Dragons in the year 2001. Thank you very much for listening. Please let me know your thoughts about what happened in the year 2001. How did that year affect you? Were you as affected as I was, just deeply saddened by the events that happened with 9/11? Did 9/11 interrupt your game, or did it? Is there in some ways where your group was able to reflect and make your game stronger because of that event? I'm really curious what your experience was in 2001. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful day.